Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. That's an amazing welcome. I hope you're as happy after my remarks. I think you will be. It is such a blessing for me to be with you all today. This is a special gathering where we can all be together to talk about an enormous threat to the world and to a freedom-loving people. It's truly an honor. Since I last spoke to you, Ibrahim Ra'isi was formally installed as Iran's latest so-called president. And you are rightly gathered here today at this conference with the theme of demanding that he be held accountable for what happened in 1988, the massacre of political prisoners inside of Iran. And I want each of you to know today that I join with you in your cause. I came to know Ra'isi when I was the CIA director. He should be prosecuted. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but we should prosecute him now. And of course, I'll talk more about this, but I support a free Iran. Bless you for staying in the fight. Make no mistake, Ibrahim Ra'isi himself, personally, is responsible for the 1988 mass execution of thousands of Iranian political prisoners. Names of over 5,000 have been published. The bodies of these brave men and women were dumped in unmarked graves. And because Iran has never, and likely under this regime will never, allowed an investigation of these killings, we do not know the true number of Iranians who were murdered. But it is almost certainly more than the 5,000 list of names that we have. Your actions, our actions, supporting our love of the Iranian people must begin by holding Ra'isi accountable for his crimes against humanity. Remember that he was not an advisor. He wasn't a foot soldier. He was an executioner. And I know that there are those in the audience who have family that were killed in Ra'isi's massacre. Some of you have loved ones and friends currently imprisoned, in Evan imprisoned, and elsewhere inside of Iran. And some who've had loved ones simply disappear or worse. None of us, will ever forget any of them, and we will pray for you and for each of them as well. You know, this character, Ra'isi, is exactly who Khamenei wants as president. Someone who will do his bidding. Someone willing to brutalize and slaughter the Iranian people at his command. This is not moving forward, it is moving backwards. It is only those who are resisting, both inside and outside, who provide the hope for Iran. And that's why this gathering, what you are doing here today, is so important. You know, the contrast between a government that serves its people rather than subjugates them is incredibly stark. We can see it. That should be all of our inspiration for freedom for the Iranian people. It's been almost 8 months now since I left office as a Secretary of State. And when we left, Iran was more isolated and the regime was weaker than ever. However, I must say, I've watched the events of the past weeks and months, and I worry. I know the Iranian people do not want that. It's why we have to keep pressure on our representatives to forgo renegotiating the nuclear deal and avoid paying Iran ransom to either re-enter that deal or because they believe it would be a show of goodwill. Goodwill is not something a terrorist regime understands. We must also ensure that advancements in the Iranian nuclear program are strictly monitored and action taken, whether that's by the United States, other Western nations, or by the IAEA, to ensure they don't just run out the clock on a path, not only to a nuclear weapon, but to a full nuclear program. I must say, over the last year or so of the pandemic, the Iranian regime has used the coronavirus to continue crackdown on its own citizens. These actions are not only ignorant, but malevolent. They've used the pandemic to extinguish uprisings and subdue the Iranian people. This is totally unacceptable. As Americans, we know supporting the general welfare of our citizens is the duty of government, and to subjugate them is horrific. And while we know the Iranian regime doesn't value freedom, we should at least expect the United States to value that freedom. And yet we know that the more a government attempts to strengthen its hold over the people of Iran, the weaker it will become. This is certainly the case today. Protests spurred by water shortages erupted in over half of the country's provinces, and protests have taken place in Araz, in Tabriz, in Tehran, and in Isfahan, and other cities all across Iran. These protesters, these amazing freedom-loving people, have shown considerable resilience and bravery in resisting the regime. And I know that in the end, the Iranian people will have a secular, democratic, and non-nuclear republic. The actions in 1979 were, of course, a key turning point. To understand Iran and its rightful place in history, we must unpack what happened in 1979. I think it's why Iran will never return to rule by a dictatorial Shah or theocratic regime. This fight is real. This is the real fight. This is the real fight. And it began in those first moments, the frightful first moments of the so-called revolution in 1979. The central fight is the one in the streets and in the mosques and in the minds of the Iranian people. It is the divide between the people and the organized opposition seeking freedom and democracy on one side, and the entirety of the regime on the other. Look, I've been at this not as long as some of you, but I've been in this fight and on the right side for over a decade now, my entire decade of public service. Back in 2010, I spoke with many of you. I spoke of the Iranian people and their history, their kindness, their respect for reason and knowledge, and their respect for human life. The Iranian people are a tolerant people. They've been a homeland for Arabs and Jews and Christians and Muslims, right on Iranian soil. This is the loveliness of the Iranian people. The Iranians want to prosper in their faith and protect their families. This is as true in Tehran as it is in any place here in the United States, and don't ever forget that. Now there's a new leader. There's a new elected, I say that word cautiously, regime headed by Khamenei's puppet Ra'isi and the IRGC. It is no less radical than the one left by the previous president. It continues to be revolutionary in its zeal. It is brutal, and it is theocratic. It is also craven and fearful of the Iranian people, and it's kleptocratic to boot. Its leaders will and have killed their own by thousands, and then choose those who committed these massive atrocities, like Ra'isi, to now lead their terror organization and their regime. Its leaders can shoot down a civilian airliner, killing hundreds of civilians, and think nothing of denying responsibility and hiding the black box that would unpack the clues and the fingerprints of the regime leaders who caused the deaths of those civilians. The leaders in Iran seek not only to dominate their own country and their people, but capitals from Baghdad to Tehran and from Damascus to Beirut and to Sana'a. All all for the petty desire to maintain their grip on power. When I last spoke to you, I noted that we must dismiss the Western conceit. I hear it even in this town in which we're sitting today. It's this Western conceit commonly accepted in Brussels and Paris and Bonn, and too many places here in the United States, that there are moderates inside of the regime. I never met one nor read of one. This is important. The lie that there are moderates inside of this regime permits too many countries to pay footsie with this very terrorist regime. The elections of last month should provide evidence that this claim of moderation is even possible with this regime. We cannot let them fool us. These are but tiny actors occupying roles in the same show of force. We know the characters. The Ayatollah plays the father, the keeper of the so-called revolutionary faith. Soleimani played the warrior hero role, deliverer of rights against made-up grievances from abroad and from afar. Don't let the title diplomat fool anyone. Ibrahim Ra'isi, a murderer of his own people, will now take on the role as the heir apparent to the faith and determined negotiator who conquers America by getting the immoral sanctions placed upon the people lifted and improving life for all. This will be the theater of Ibrahim Ra'isi. These actors, each of them, all of them, will keep this show going despite the audience wanting their run to come to an end. And they're prepared to use every power, to use the IRGC, to use the Basij, and any tool to keep their grip over the Iranian people. There's nothing new about them. They're just the next generation of the regime, perhaps even more radical than their predecessors. Every one of them should be held accountable. All of them should be held for the tens of thousands of Iranians that they have murdered. And world leaders, I hope you're listening. World leaders should band together to reject Ra'isi. Each of you should reject Ra'isi. You should refuse to engage with him, to acknowledge him as the democratically elected president by the people, since he was no such thing. A good place to start would be by this week at the United Nations General Assembly, not too far from where we're all sitting, holding Ra'isi accountable for his crimes against the people of Iran. It's possible to do. Speaking of Ra'isi's actions, Kumi Naidu, the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2018 to 2020, said in his remarks to the call for justice, he said, quote, "I served as the Secretary General of Amnesty International, during which time a report was brought out on this terrible tragedy, the tragedy of 1988 that we saw take place in Iran. Let us be very clear. What happened in 1988 was a totally brutal massacre of political prisoners, which is in itself a crime against humanity. This former leader of Amnesty International closed with this. And if you go with the definition, notwithstanding the technicalities, it amounts to genocide. We know a bit about this. Look, we have to keep the Iranian regime in a box. Contrast the current administration's posture towards the regime with the one that the Trump administration had. Our mission was really very simple. We laid down 12 very simple demands, 12 requirements that made clear that if the Iranian regime failed to do that, we would apply every American power. Indeed, we would build a coalition around the world to deny the regime power to kill its own people and to foment terror around the region and indeed around the world. This seems so straightforward to me. We formed alliances. But here's the good news. The resistance forces of Iran, those noble Iranian patriots, are as strong as they have ever been, and they provide optimism for everyone around them who supports them. You do that too. You can actually see this. You can actually see the effects of last year's of our work in their recent elections. Every more effort had to be made. The regime became more desperate. The fraud had to be increased, and the Iranian people could see it plain as day. Since 1979, every election in Iran has served only to give the appearance of republicanism to a corrupt and brutal theocracy. The 2021 presidential election, however, was really different. It was vastly different than those before it, primarily because it's taking place when the theocratic regime is at its most precarious state since it took power in 1979. And the people of Iran know this. Its prospects for survival are openly questioned by regime insiders and challenged by a restive, freedom-seeking nation. In short, you all know the math. Very few actually voted for Ra'isi. Turnout was the lowest since 1979, marking a total rejection of the regime and its candidate. Even the regime finally had to admit it. For the first time in 40 years, it admitted that the majority of Iranian people stayed away from the ballot box. It was, in fact, a boycott of the regime, and the regime leaders fear it and know it. This boycott by the Iranian people is evidence that the Iranian people pin no hope on elections as a conduit for substantive change for them. The program that we had implemented also served to lay bare the regime's economic incompetence, its systemic corruption and outright plunder of the country's wealth. It's pushed more than 80% of the population below the poverty line. These people, they can see the corrupt ruling theocracy as their true enemy and first and foremost cause of their economic crisis. You know, one of the most dominant slogans in the recent uprising has been, "Our enemy is right here." They lie when they say it is America. As with history is replete with protest movements, as with all protest movements, flags were burned, right? This is what people do. But now the most common flag being burned was not the Israeli or the American flag, but the flag of this evil regime. So what's ahead? How do we all move forward together? What is the path that we move down? The regime at its weakest point now in 40-plus years of existence, and Iranians from every corner of the nation seeing with their own eyes the failure of the regime to deliver on the very promises that it made. The epic incompetence in handling COVID-19 is ongoing. Vaccination in Iran is at among the lowest rates in the entire world, not because it's not a sophisticated people, it's because the vaccine is available, but the regime refuses to accept vaccines from those prepared to give it to them. Indeed, they rejected it from the Trump administration. This epic incompetence and quest for nuclear power has made it a pariah, has made Iran, the regime, a pariah even to its fellow Muslim countries in the region. Its epic incompetence is simply ruining a nation that has resulted in food and gas and the most basic staples unaffordable, and the nation's ability to respond to natural disasters and earthquakes almost non-existent. The Iranian people are wise. They can see that the regime is not working. The people know it. Now, as for President Ra'isi, he's not the president of the people of Iran. He's the president for the Ayatollah, and his mission's pretty clear. His mission's pretty clear. Inflict pain, frighten, continue to loot and plunder, protect the clerics and protect the Republican guards. He was chosen by the Ayatollah now because he's only 60 years old and thus could lead for the next 2 or 3 decades. I don't believe that's the fate for the Iranian people. This time, these years, will give him the time he needs to get his own people into place and demonstrate that the Supreme Leader wants him to have time for the next phase of this so-called revolution. He'll use the IRGC, he'll use its Quds Force to generate conflict externally, to deflect attention, to maintain the narrative of the oppressed. The path forward. The path forward is this calls for a clear response. The United States must lead the world, starting today, on this occasion, to hold him accountable for the crimes against humanity that he committed. Any dealings with Abraham Ra'isi would be tantamount to dealing with a mass murderer. This is not only immoral, but counterproductive. All of us should make this clear to our allies in Europe, our friends around the world in Asia, and hold them accountable if they deal with this man that sent thousands of his own countrymen to execution in 1988. Of the total control of the Ayatollah over everything, so that nothing moves without his blessing inside of that country. As for whether pressure drives Iran to continue its authoritarian ways, it's obvious. It's obvious that Iran's leadership has been static or trending right for 2 decades. The world often overstates its influence on domestic politics. It is the people of Iran who have the power. And moreover, while Ra'isi and others have criticized this nuclear deal, it touches on none of their equities. Thus, they get to use the deal politically and reap the benefits from resources received to protect the Ayatollah and his henchmen. So he'll complain about the deal, he'll use it to gain more concessions from a deal-hungry United States, but he won't in the end block it. And I worry too. I worry that the situation on the Iranian border in Afghanistan, the Iranians watched. They watched as the United States projected weakness and chaos as it withdrew from Afghanistan. And we know that the Iranians thrive on weakness. We also know that it always emboldens our adversaries. In fact, in the wake of our Afghanistan withdrawal, here's what Ra'isi said, quote, "America's military defeat and its withdrawal must become an opportunity to restore life, security, and durable peace in Afghanistan. Iran backs efforts to restore stability in Afghanistan, and as a neighboring and brother nation, Iran invites all groups in Afghanistan to reach a national agreement." End of quote. Let me translate that for you. Iran welcomes Afghanistan as another tool in the terrorist hub of the axis of resistance. They don't want good things for the Afghan people any more than they want good things for their own people. They want the very power that they have so dearly clutched onto for these decades at the expense of the Iranian people. It's worth us all remembering today that this isn't the first connection to external terror. The Ayatollah already hosts the most senior al-Qaeda leadership in his country. Let me say that again. Al-Qaeda International, the headquarters for al-Qaeda's operational leaders that builds out plots across the world, is not in Afghanistan. It is not in the Afpak border. It is not in Pakistan. They're being hosted, protected, and operating today from Tehran. And don't forget this, the Ayatollah didn't truly conduct a revolution, although he'll claim that. No, revolutions move their people towards modernity and reason and to light. This was not a revolution, but a devolution of the basic standards of human rights that the rich history of Iran had promoted for decades and decades. There is not far from here, at think tanks and in salons and at some of the nicer parties, there's this idea that there's no solution if the regime is overthrown. The Ayatollah and many will tell you that you're better off with the devil you know. The Iranian people don't believe that for a second because it's fundamentally untrue. There are many paths forward, and all of them are better for the Iranian people than the status quo. And preparing, as we're doing, preparing the transition to a new Iran as a task for today, we should start by securing the humanitarian well-being of the Iranian people as they make this transition. Over the years, it's been demonstrated that the Iranian culture makes toppling. And you should know that nearly 100% of ordinary Iranians believe the regime's days are numbered. I believe that too. I'm also deeply heartened by the fact that the Iranian people are making abundantly clear that they are increasingly unafraid of the regime. Rather than punish Iran for its continued aggression against us and our partners in the Middle East, sadly, the Biden administration is trying to get back in the nuclear deal with a much weaker hand. As was the case with the Trump administration, human rights and counterterrorism should be at the forefront of our policy, not appeasing the Iranian regime. We worked tirelessly to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon and a nuclear program. We have to apply pressure until they change or until reforms which move Iran towards a democratic form of government take place. We cannot shower the Ayatollah with money and economic benefits in the hopes that they won't be used to inflict terror and oppression. We've seen this bad story before. This thinking is foolish and it's backwards. The program of sanctions and pressure that was employed by the Trump administration needs to remain the model if we want to ensure the security of the American people and the freedom of the people of Iran. I pray that the United States will not increase the resources that the Ayatollah has at its disposal to empower this theocracy. Engagement with the regime will lengthen the time that Iran and its regime has to behave as it has for these past decades, denying basic human dignity. Remember that the Ayatollah's power grab was not so much a revolution, but a devolution. It's important to remember that. It was a lesson for me that I learned, and I must say I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that the world has learned much about the theocracy in Iran these past years. And it's not that we didn't see it before. You all have seen it before. Around the world, you can see that even as Europe, the tide of tolerance for the regime is slipping. This is a good thing. We must continue to support the Iranian people as they fight for a freer and more democratic Iran in any way that they can. There is so much good work to do, and you all are doing it today. In the end, the Iranian people will have a secular, democratic, non-nuclear republic. I pray that this day will come soon. It is such a joy to be with you all today. I pray that these days will come soon for the Iranian people, with the support of Iranians living all across the world and those who resist from within. They are noble people. The day will come sooner. I'm committed to this cause. I know everyone in this room is as well. May your mission be blessed and the Iranian people protected and provided for always. It is a hopeful time, a deeply hopeful time, a time to redouble our efforts. Thank you for having me here today. God bless you, and may God bless the Iranian people.